Chapter 171, Morning Walk. It was a bright but cloudy day in the territory. The atmosphere was comfortably temperate, and almost everyone was outside. The sun's embrace was warm but not too hot. The sky stretched expansively, with the soft breeze greeting everyone good morning. At this time, there were already plenty of people hunting outside the territory, and many more heading out, weapons out, ready to accompany the guards in clearing out the surroundings of enemies. They were mostly guards, but there were also plenty of citizens, a lot of whom hoped to get the job during the next openings. Being a guard was still the best. Not only would you get stronger, you'd be rewarded in and of itself. Also, the guards were very cool. There were also the people who were hired by the territory to get the carcasses of the monsters killed by the sentries, provided there weren't maggots, of course. One feature of this place was, as the resources refreshed at a miraculous rate, so did the decomposition of dead things on the soil. This included food. One could imagine thinking a barbecue would be perfectly fine after not eating it after resting a couple of hours, only to wake up with it filled with maggots. Interestingly, this only happened outside of the territory, so biscuits and noodles were especially popular, even if the trip outside only lasted a day. The maggots here were very scary and very, very ugly. Although they didn't actively attack people like in those scary apocalypse movies, accidentally touching them would be painful and could lose someone major amounts of spirit. Anyway, their jobs were to check whether the meat had maggots or not. They were instructed to ignore those meats with maggots and double-checking those that did not for further processing. The territory was increasing, and almost everyone was used to eating meat every meal, back to how it was, which surprised even the rich aborigines. Further, after improving their physiques, their food requirement increased as well. The system restaurant probably provided food that better considered the changed physiques, but they still wouldn't exchange it for the food they had now. The difference wasn't much anyway, and they only had to eat a little more meat. Overall, one could imagine the meat consumption. This also meant that the mobs hunted outside weren't enough anymore, for now anyway. Of course, the meat was studied thoroughly for consumption before being sold at the discount markets, and the other parts were sold to leather manufacturers like Sassy the tanner. Bones were also sold to Baron's group, as they could create various tools, even needles from it. As for the rest of the carcasses, they were asked to be sent to the composting pit to be made into fertilizers. The inside the territory, on the other hand, was no less lively. There was a bustle of activity in pretty much every corner of the village. Regardless of activity, laughter and chatter flowed freely in the village, as neighbors caught up with news and gossip as they prepared for their day. First, there were already a lot of people perusing the interior forests at that time, cleaning out loose wood and stones to sell and find plants to eat. Then there was the marketplace that was already bustling with life. The stall owners laid out their products and wares to sell, wearing welcoming smiles on their faces, imagining the day's sales. On these stalls, there were also various colorful fruits on display, herbs, handicrafts, and the like. Some people also started selling Terran items for novelty, still for high prices, selling them as if they were antiques. For example, plastic ware, jewelry that wasn't converted to xenocurrency, and even things like storybooks, toys, and the like. Interestingly, these people had hoarded these things not on their own, but mostly bought from others early in the migration. This reminded her of the stories of people hoarding antiques back in Terran during the Great Famine, and getting rich when they regained their values. The industrial factories were not yet open, but the makeshift armory and weapons stores were. The experts' hammers and tools had rhythmically prepared for the start of production, and one could already imagine the goodness that would be created. Other than these, the aroma of freshly cooked goods and baked bread bathed the air, relaxing everyone's souls. Overall, there were very few people idle in the territory, and people seemed to have somewhat recovered from the disasters of the previous week. Of course, it would take a long time, if ever, for people to truly go back to the peaceful life in Terran, back when people's biggest problems were breakups and not being able to afford luxury bags. But people were resilient, and the territory provided them with enough stability and peace they so needed. The people's relaxed faces, in contrast to the despaired look of when they had just entered, was something Althea appreciated with relish as she walked to the industrial park. "Pretty miss, come buy some of my fruits." No, buy mine." "Buy juice, miss." "You look beautiful, this jam would make you even more so." While the marketplace was still under construction, A lot of stalls, even towards the east gate, had popped up. Most of them, though, sold fruits and vegetables harvested in the territory. After all, a good part of the territory had been making good money relative to the low cost of living. They now had more than enough purchasing power to just spend money on local fruits instead of picking them up themselves. Hence, although she placed a limit on the amount of cheap fruit and plants the citizens could take within the territory, this business was still booming because the scavengers could still make some money even if they paid for the extra things they picked. "Old man, feed your daughter well, she's so beautiful. My fruits are very healthy, your dad and Barbies would love it." Oh my, there are Barbies. It seemed that, subconsciously, people didn't associate strollers with Barbies here. After all, adults died easily in this place, what more of children? They probably thought she was pushing a small shopping cart or something. However, Althea was in a good mood and allowed the many bystanders to admire her children. Of course, she limited the number so the Barbies didn't get smothered. They looked at the toothless smiles of the children, and their hearts softened into puddles. "How old are they?" "A few days old," she said, and some people looked at her, thinking how could they not remember there was such a beautiful pregnant woman walking around. Althea was not surprised. After all, she rarely went out of the house except when going to the farm. Most people had really not seen her at all. However, someone did actually recognize her. The person gasped, looking at her as if looking at a star. "You're the pretty pregnant woman who's hiring so many people," he said. "My roommate is one of your farmers," he said, eyes beaming with joy. "Congratulations on giving birth." She smiled and said thanks, until she realized the looks others were giving her. The looks on her sizzled even more, probably due to her CEO status, making her feel awkward. Who could blame them, though? Everyone who were updated with current affairs knew that those who worked for her team were living very well, much better than others. They heard that there were also bonuses from their restaurant or grocery if you worked well. These bonuses were in the form of food and ingredients, some of which were not yet available to the public. The people looked at them hungrily, and Harold's cowardly side showed as he hid behind the boss and the strollers. Althea's eyes twitched. Why did she suddenly feel like a golden goose hunted by everyone? Chapter 172, Factories. Althea cleared her throat. "Thank you for your blessings," she said. "Now if you'll excuse. Would you start hiring again soon?" "Well, while my hiring of farm hands is already closed, my team and I are also developing other industries. There are also many people developing businesses. I'm sure more job opportunities will be open. We are currently heading to the factories just built, if you'd excuse us." The people sparkled, but they dared not harass her, lest they give her a bad impression. And finally they were free. Of course, some yells like "my name is so-and-so, and I'm a very good worker," were thrown here and there. There were also "my name is so-and-so, and I can handle anything. Please choose me, remember my name is so-and-so." Harold and Althea looked at each other with amused faces, their pace increasing to escape the passionate crowd. She and Harold got to the industrial park after several minutes of walking, heaving a sigh of relief. The industrial part was a gated area, also with level 2 walls, to prevent non-workers from entering. The road was a wide 6-meter wide carriageway, in consideration of future population and productivity. To date, there were already 10 factories completed in the industrial park, 5 of which she rented in her name, though one of them was in another zone and was ongoing construction. One was the sauce and seasoning factory, with about a score of workers bound by contract. They were all capable of cooking, and they even set up a system where the workers could suggest formulas. In this system, her company would pay for the materials and apply to work within working hours, but if done well, they would get a share of the proceeds. Depending on the potential and uniqueness of the formula, the share of the worker ranged from 10 to 30%. 2 sauces had been produced this way, albeit they were still under production and were not yet available in the market. One was the sour sauce made by an old woman named Loa. The taste was delicious, like a special type of vinegar. Another was called the flu powder by old Chef Coco. It was a powder of questionable color that added a slight umami taste. Although it was not nearly as strong as what the MSG they were used to, it was the next best thing available. She had also tested the formula, and it was still healthier than their conventional MSG. And these were developed only after a week since they started the program. She was looking forward to what else could be developed given more time and resources. They had a walkthrough of the factories, taking note of areas of improvement. They also spoke with the workers if they had suggestions. "Hello, boss," they greeted them with respect and admiration. They also couldn't help but peek at the cuties in the stroller. "So cute." "Good work," Althea said, looking at each one of them. The workers were extremely flattered. "Well, we are thankful for the opportunity. We were discussing about what we can improve, or perhaps products we can aim for. Do you have any suggestions?" It was Coco who stepped forward. "Boss, I have received some requests and we were wondering when and if we have mustards." She blinked. She had not yet encountered a mustard plant so far, but it was noted. "Noted." The old man brightened at being heard, and a few others said their piece. Someone even asked for a banana ketchup, which was an odd choice, but he said his town liked it a lot, and some dishes would do well with it. In any case, she noted all of their concerns, promising to see what she could do before moving on to the next factory. Harold did not come with her this time, as he stayed here to plan the other selection of sauce, as well as the determination of the most effective production lines. The next factory was the plant mixing factory, where the medicine from the pharmacy, now predominantly handled by Lily, was being made. There were only 10 women for now, because the consumption of medicine in the territory wasn't that large yet. Of course, it didn't mean the profit here was smaller than the others. On the contrary, because the formulas were so special, the profit margin was quite large. Especially her patented Band-Aid and Sprite. For her specially made formulations, they added the brand premium, making for even larger profits, ranging from 30 times the cost to 100. The third was the processing plant for wheat, rice, and other future similar crops. Other than the rice and flour, they have also developed starch and yeast, as well as rice, wine, and sake. The fourth was food processing for some of the finished food products they took on, such as pickled vegetables or dried meat. There was also a large kiln for baking bread and biscuits, as well as frying food like instant noodles. For the last factory, they chose one in another zone. The industrial area was zoned into two, one half for edible items and the other for not. Their waste management and delivery were also zoned and handled accordingly. Her last factory was in the latter zone. 5 per type of factory had already been built, and she only took one in the other zone. It was a factory reserved for her fertilizers. When she got the chance to gather more wool wood, she would also assign a factory for its products, like rubber, glue, and other derivatives of resins. Speaking of which, more and more products would soon be available, and her little grocery store wouldn't fit the variety of items anymore. She made a silent note to order the construction team to prioritize the supermarket next, in the name of the territory, of course. Mentally taking notes of these things, she leisurely pushed the stroller along the paved road of the industrial park. After a few minutes, her green eyes caught sight of a group of people standing in a circle not too far away from her. They had wide smiles on their faces, chatting about some interesting things. As she went closer, she recognized who they were. A few of them were still acquaintances. It was the team who rented the 3 factories in this area for their wood, leather, and other products, the team with the largest industry, next to hers, of course. Her emerald eyes zoned in on the person talking the most, looking very animated. Baron Smith, her biggest taxpayer. Baron Smith, her biggest taxpayer. As hyperactive and horizontally blessed as always, he chatted excitedly with his team members about some developments in the territory. Speaking of this guy, his furniture wood toy store not only sold a lot of products, he also bought and rented a lot of properties. In total, this guy had hired almost 100 people on his own. This increased the spending power of the people by leaps and bounds. Next to her, he contributed the most to the current economy. A very good taxpayer indeed. As they approached, she could hear them discussing excitedly. Did you see the latest mission? The one for capturing Gugu birds. It wasn't a territory mission, was it? No, it was the Altheans. Altheans? Althea's eyebrows furrowed, and her eyes twitched, realizing what team they were referring to. It's no. They didn't name their team after her, did they? Oh gee. Baron whipped his head to see her there, and he visibly brightened. He raised his hand to greet her. Speaking of which, here's the boss. Althea rubbed her temples. Baron didn't seem to notice how her face turned a beet green. Instead, he raised his hand and greeted very loudly, "High boss of Altheans, woodworkers here. Do they make team names now, and why did they all sound so stupid?" She sighed and plastered a smile on her face as she walked forward. "Hello, good morning." "Good morning, Ms. Althea Tilda, we were just talking about your team. We're so curious about the mission Ms. Sheila sent out through the village center, the goo-goo thingy one. Could it be what I thought?" Althea nodded. "It's basically local chickens, beasts that were relatively weak but with high fecundity." "Oh," he exclaimed, and everyone looked at her with bright eyes wanting to know more. "How's the taste?" "It is edible. Its meat was also softer than beasts and could be used as livestock. We heard it from Oslo." Among the NPCs, it could be said Oslo was the most approachable, so she used his name without thinking. Anyway, she knew he wouldn't mind. That guy was so approachable that a lot of Terrans called him Brother Oslo. Rumor said that he already made a girlfriend or two, and they still cooperated very well. Anyway, the news of potential livestock in the territory energized everyone. "Chickens, we're going to have chickens." "Well, it shouldn't taste exactly the same." "It doesn't matter," Baron said, looking at her like a sycophant. "Sell some to me, okay? I'm willing to buy twice the value." Although he could send out a mission under his name, it would feel a bit low. Not to mention, he had no idea about the characteristics of the bird. It was still more cost-effective to go through Althea instead. Besides, he and Oslo, they really didn't get along well. You see, when he realized that Sheila didn't have any idea for him at all, he moved on from this 76th crush. He thought it was the 77th, perhaps he'd have better luck. But this crush got obsessed with Oslo instead. He could still remember the beautiful Thessie, wavy brown hair and bright brown eyes, so lovely when she bought so many of his products. Thessie was really pretty and poised, like a lady. It so happened that he had just been depressed from being friend-zoned by Sheila, and he fell in love at first sight. He naturally chased after her, giving her discounts and stuff, and then giving her gifts. She accepted them all with a smile, and hope ignited in him. The reason he was so obsessed with money was because he had watched a show once where the person was super ugly, but because he was rich, he could get all the girls he wanted. And yet he had never had a girlfriend despite having money. Never. Such a mystery. But he was aiming to end this streak on his lucky 77th. Anyway, he had planned his proposal for courtship very well. He had already commissioned his team to make her pretty hairpins that would suit her sewer well. Fancy his surprise when he saw the poised Thessie following Oslo around like a mindless fangirl. He didn't have anything against fangirls, but it was depressing to see one's crush going after another man. However, he managed to suck it up and just categorize the admiration as idolizing a star, like Fable. But then he actually saw her lock lips with the man and his heart broke. And because he was given hope, his reaction was quite strong, to say the least. It involved a lot of shouting and snot and saliva from yelling being splurted around. Looking at him all bitter, Althea held back a smile. The altercation between those two was no secret. Sheila and Harold gossiped about it for a whole dinner. "Sure, you can also rent a farm and raise your own livestock farm." "That's a good idea," he said, "but I have too much on my plate now. Maybe we just raise them for the team." "Congratulations on your expansion, by the way," she said. "I heard you have nearly 100 people working for you." Baron scratched his cheek shyly. "Well, so many people came here and there was no furniture. Furniture is a very time-consuming job and the demand is very good." Speaking of which, the dormitories now had full double-deck rooms, saving space for the users. There were also tables and chairs. It had to be noted that all this furniture was commissioned at the cost of the occupants themselves, which would be donated to the building when they left the dormitories. So even if they saved up to move out, they left the furniture in the room for the next person. It was a culture of passing forward that started somehow the past week or so. It was all very convenient. Not to mention, because the makers were the same group, the beds had a uniform appearance, making it look all organized and nice. Baron couldn't take all the credit. "I was lucky to get to know talents," he said, embarrassed. "Besides, you don't hire any less, you even contribute more variety. Also, you yourself are the technical talent. I think you are amazing." "Thank you," she said. "Well, it's all so we could live well, right?" Baron smiled, his head turning to his team with happy smiles. As he stared, he couldn't help but remember the people they lost before they found this safe haven they now called home. Indeed, he repeated, eyes warming, everything is just so we could live well. Baron turned his attention back to Althea, seeming to be reminded of something. How's old Eugene? Still working on your project, she said. She knew that he was partnering with Eugene to create bicycles. Oslo created metal for them, but producing permanent metal was so much work, and only a few grams a day had been produced. It had been several days, but there was still no movement. But from what she heard at home, it seemed that Eugene had made some progress, something about minimizing the need for metal lugs. Eugene also got the largest share of this project, and he promised her, the boss, some shares as well. It seemed like she'd take about 10% of the profits, without having to do anything at all. It was very nice of him. In fact, even if Eugene wasn't a teammate, such a share was very smart to give to the Lord, as it would ensure the proper support for its development. In this topic, she also heard Baron's woodworking factory was working on wooden wheels and axles. Even if it wasn't bikes, rickshaws, and maybe carriages, if someone could tame beasts, would arrive in the territory soon. For now, they produced rickshaws, because no one knew how to tame animals to carry people. Anyways, whichever mode of transportation would be introduced, Althea would welcome them with open arms. There were a lot of people in the territory who were looking for safe jobs with minimal skills. They had a minimum requirement for training, so she didn't worry too much about their strengths stagnating. There were also quite a few people, a lot of whom used to be strong men, who had lost arms and hands before reaching her territory. They were thus unable to do most of the jobs needed in the territory. This job would suit them just fine. In any case, although the development for transportation would not be seen within these few days, she could already see her bustling territory with its own transportation. She was looking forward to it. And she really wanted to reward those who were making these things a reality. Althea silently took note of adding a good amount of contribution to the people who would make this happen. Reward those who deserved it. This was the way to keep innovations going. I've already applied to rent another factory, Baron told her, focusing on these wheeled contraptions. She nodded, congratulating him. With this, Baron was now renting 4 factories, one for household furniture, one for other wood shenanigans, one for tanning works, and the currently being built factory for the aforementioned wheeled contraptions. Because factories were only for rent, the 5-owned real estate limit didn't apply. Similarly, when Althea rented tens and tens of farmland, no one questioned her. Well, I'm sure you'll succeed, she said, pointing at the stroller. I can personally attest to the quality of your products. Bianca and Joe, who were the main technical talents of Baron's company, blushed at the compliments. Especially Bianca, who had worked very hard for the Barbie's accessories. At the mention of the children, Baron's and his companion's eyes had instantaneously landed in the covered crib. But they, at least those other than Bianca and Baron, weren't close enough to Althea to handle the Barbies with ease. Now that Althea herself opened the topic, they were happy to jump in. They really liked these kids very much, not only because they were supremely adorable, but also because they were their unwitting muses. It was Althea's requests for toys and playgrounds that actually inspired them to create the product line in the first place. Even without seeing the Barbies, they were already considered their muses. But seeing them now and their cute chubby cheeks and large colourful eyes, their position as forever muses of the product line was cemented into stone. So cutty. Are they awake? Bianca asked, eyes so eager no one could refuse. May I hold them? Althea was just gesturing to nod, and Bianca was already holding a baby. Later, the group doted on the children very happily, making the kids laugh in glee. They already started discussing a toy line for children and giving the children several copies for free. They also began to explore more playground features. They seemed very passionate about this. When the wheels are made, we could make those seesaws, spinners, and merry-go-rounds. Eventually, when we get the technology, we could make things like carousels. Very cool, but we must use Terran animals as seat models. If we use the local beasts, maybe the kids would think they're friendly and try to pet them. He gasped at the image. Can you imagine? A child running towards a monster, thinking it was their friend. Gasp. You realize they're Barbies, one said, rolling their eyes. They won't even go outside. But we have a few children, they won't be unused. Yes, eyes, our territory is amazing and safe. Soon children will be running around for sure. Artilda, how lovely that would be. Children running around, going to school, giggling and making our hearts happy. Yes, eyes. Someone better develop paper already. How are we going to have books for school? A team's perfecting it already. Can I write an autobiography? Do you think it will sell? Another one thought out loud. No, even better, novels. I should get my wife to write novels again. You idiot, people would be interested in knowledge first. No, you're the idiot. I remember you read e-novels instead of studying when you were a little brat, so of course novels would sell. You don't know, people have their basic needs now. What better way to meet spiritual needs than a good book? This went on for a while, and Althea watched fondly. She looked warmly at the group of people doing their part to improve lives. When people were working hard for the territory, she, as the Lord, felt both proud and energized to continue doing what she had been doing. Everyone was sincerely working for the territory. Whether it was for themselves or their families, it was a great thing for the solidarity of the land. A community with one mind could always perform miracles. Althea had a feeling they were already starting. When Althea came back to the house, she was finally able to ask the others about the issue that had been bugging her the whole day. Altheans, really? Althea asked, crossing her arms, watching as they plated the food for dinner. And she thought she had a bad namming sense. Well, teams have been forming and it's so weird not to have a name, Sheila told her with a sheepish smile. Harold was quick to nod. Yes, mostly people who came together often named teams and lived together. Aren't we just like that? Althea sighed but understood their need for an entity. After all, they handled businesses together. It was odd to just refer to the group as just the team. But still, why Althean? I think it sounds cool, very fitting of your great self, Sheila said slyly, making Althea roll her eyes. Also, it sounds like the territory name, so we mused it was quite fitting. Althea's eyes twitched. Seeing that no one intended to change the address, she tried to think of an alternative instead. What about Eden? Dennis Team's already got that name. What about Terran Team? Mathilda's team took it. Didn't Jim's team also call themselves that? Really? Wouldn't that be confusing then? Later. It would be great to build a system for guilds or teams. Sheila thought out loud, though she felt she was just being wistful. However, this made Althea the Lord pause. Why not? She asked, and everyone stared at her, eyes brightening when it dawned on them. Let me ask the NPCs, she said, opening her Lord panel. Perhaps there's an existing registration system already. She then sent invitations to the pertinent individuals. Due to the business of everyone's schedule, the number of meetings was reduced to about twice a week, one of which was set to be with elders, unless there were emergencies. That night happened to be this meeting day. After dinner, the group convened with the elders to hold the first meeting together. Gru, Mathilda and Eugene were quite nervous. This was the first time they were going to the second floor after all. Even Mathilda and Eugene, who had the advantage of knowing the Lord, felt a little tingly. Especially old Gru, who didn't, was particularly antsy. If he was to be honest, he was actually a little scared. There were plenty of legends about this floor, rooted in its mystery, and the fact that no one but the NPCs knew what was inside. The people who did the fit-out work signed an NDA, so they couldn't squeeze anything out of them, making the place appear even more mysterious. It was said that in the room there was sand, and from this sand, NPCs were formed to become humanoid creatures. There was also a legend that there were test tubes there, with one getting activated whenever the territory summoned an NPC. Anyway, it was all very silly, but still made him quite nervous. It didn't help that they became a spectacle the moment they took a step up the stairs. Under the interested eyes of several people who were using the lower floors, the three elders climbed up the stairs and were able to turn the knob at the top of the flight, unlike the others who could not even move it by an inch. Althea, having happily entered the second floor without having to sneak around, and the Aborigines had arrived a bit earlier, was now lounging as they waited for the others. Of course, Althea reminded them of how to address her when there were others. Speaking of the NPCs, their quantities were the same as before, without additional members. The past few days, there had not been a new NPC that interested Althea, so she deferred today's summoning after the meeting. Perhaps she'd gain some luck. In any case, Althea and the NPCs had already discussed some issues in the territory, and now very few concerns were left. Most of the issues remaining required other people's expertise, which was just right. The format of the meeting was basically reporting any updates that had happened in the territory the past week. She reported the status of her plants, especially the Terran plants, and also the possible uses she found of local ones, which really intrigued the Aborigines very much. For example, the Lord spoke of a plant, cocoa, that could produce the most wonderful dessert. Based on what many of the elders' reactions were, dreamy, drooling a bit, then it must be very delicious. Too bad it would still take a couple of months to grow. There were also interesting uses for the plants they grew up with. For instance, the omnipresent flute plant was no longer just for food, but it could also be used to make what the Lord called ethanol biofuel or something. It was apparently helpful for the clinic, and to prevent infections, killing tiny creatures called bacteria that could cause infections. Of course, whether it could truly kill xenobacteria was still up for study. The Lord couldn't help but add. Eugene reported the status of the creations, which were the bicycle and a machine that made something they called paper. Similarly, the others also reported on their respective scopes. One of the last to present was Mathilda, who proposed a simple justice system to deal with small altercations that didn't need the system's interference. I have already gathered people from related fields. Now I only need to put them for vetting. They nodded in agreement. Better if the guard team is involved. Yes, I've already coordinated with Rowan and Drake. Gru, on the other hand, reported the successful crossing of 2 breeds of wheat, improving the yield. Not only this, but he was also crossbreeding several vegetables. If combined properly with Terran yield, this could get even better. For instance, he combined the goji berries with their grapes, creating a quaint taste that was absolutely fabulous. For instance, he also combined the local warmelon with the Terran watermelon. The end product was sweet watermelon with a strong aftertaste. Not everyone would like its taste, but he found it interesting anyway, so he went ahead with the experiments. Althea was particularly interested in this. I'll lend you some of my fertilizer. It was formulated for Terran plants. Good. Gru was extremely excited. This meant he could experiment even more. Gru was actually one of the people who had grown to love this place. After all, plants grew so much and so quickly, and he could really see the evolution and changes in his experiments with his own eyes. It could be said that Gru was still one of the most optimistic people in the territory, and he was a pleasure to work with. The discussions continued for about half an hour before it was done. The attendees chatted as they waited to be dismissed, but Althea turned her head to the Aborigines. I'm curious about something. Ask ahead, Ms. Althea. As you may have noticed, a lot of our people have formed their own teams. She began, do we have a team system available outside? The Aborigines looked at each other before answering. They kept forgetting the Lord, and everyone else did not have the common sense they grew up with. As always, it was the erudite Oslo who explained, well, there is nothing that could stop a group of people from forming teams. He said, pausing, however, while forming teams is technically arbitrary, forming official teams is not. Official teams, Gru asked, also interested in this topic. Official teams are basically teams from one territory who could deal or do business with other territories, like an individual requiring a legitimate identity before doing any business at all. Hearing other territories excited the 2 old people quite a bit. They had heard about the other territories and did hope to know more. Both of them traveled intensively back in Terran. With their age, they had already been exposed to most cultures in existence. They were particularly looking forward to seeing new ones. Oslo looked at them and continued to speak. After all, territories must protect themselves. Speaking of this, if a group of people exceeded 100 people, forming an official group would be mandatory. Most territories would choose to disband this group themselves otherwise. Althea nodded in understanding. This was probably to prevent the creation of a power outside the Lord's control. That said, she had a hunch that a new tab in her Lord panel would show information about the teams when they were available. Similarly, once made official, the registered team will have the sole right to their name. Anyone purposely making unapproved deals in the name of another team would be punishable by law. That was to say, the law from the system. As for how the system punished people, she heard it ranged from automatic deduction of items of the space, or banning of certain skills, to the reduction of important stats among others. There are a lot of types of official teams, the most common of which are the trade teams and mercenary teams. In either case, the registration must pass through the village center. We can do this now. Oslo shook his head. From what I know, the requirement is a level 3 village. It would also be through the village town city center that the updated lists of teams and their territories are listed. Of course, there's a small fee to pay. Gru was very curious about everything, especially the Aborigines' territory. Could he buy new seeds from these teams in the future? How much? It depends on the lord. Clutch nodded. I once had to hire a mercenary team to gather some materials for me. The initial payment for access to the list of names costs about a silver. The hiring costs were a bit more expensive. Speaking of this, Oslo then remembered a few more points. Territories also reserve the right to determine the rights and limitations of teams. Though I think the base fee of 100 gold for creating a team is fixed, everything else could be manipulated. For example, a maximum membership of 100 people, maximum number of elementalists, among others. There was also a certain amount of tax per month to be paid to the territory they were operating in, which would depend on the lord. In cities, it was typically about 10% on top of the usual taxes. Harold pursed his lips. It sounded troublesome. What are the other advantages of building a team? Big teams could also build their own places within a territory, if the lord allows. They can also hire people through the town centers, but they will pay twice as much as the lord does. This meant that official teams, in a way, was a certain entity in and of itself. Many forces would become teams just for the feeling of power. You really know a lot, Brenda commented. The last few points even they didn't know. Oslo looked proud, combing back his golden hair, and sent them a winning smile. Well, the cousin of an ex is a lord of a town, he said. I learned a lot from them. Fair old town. That same day, thousands of kilometers away, Garin and the others stood in the town center with deep frowns. Geez, 100 gold registration fee is really expensive, Gil mumbled, looking at the tablet. And there's an additional 10 gold for every 10 members. What a scam. I told you I can lend you some money. A foxy woman sauntered next to Gil, flirtatiously wiping her well-manicured finger on his chest. Gil shivered but didn't do anything, and he even had to hold back his poisonous tongue. Who told this woman to be the cousin of the lord here? She was a gorgeous woman with purple hair and eyes. Even after months in this place, it still took a while to get used to all these odd hair and eye colors. Garen's lips twitched in amusement, and the others held back their laughter at his constipated face. Gil glared at them and lightly pushed her hand away. Cassandra pouted. However, she was a decent woman who still had some boundaries. She took a step back and let her future lover's teammates join him in front of the tablet. What do we name the team, boss? Garen was silent. He had wanted to name it Althea or any of the cute couple names she came up with. Unfortunately, he was simply leading this team and did not think he owned it. In the end, he chose something they all related to. Garen paused for a moment, opening his mouth, and his low baritone voice sounded across the halls. Terran mercenary team. After walking out with the other elders and going home, she teleported back to the second floor of the warehouse to go back to the village center, precisely to where she stood 10 minutes earlier. The lengths she had to go through to hide her identity. She stood in front of the summoning circle, heaving a sigh. Hopefully, this time she would be able to summon a decent NPC. Well, ideally. For some reason, it was getting pointedly more difficult each day to encounter a good NPC. More often than not, she just wasted her silver trying to get a good option. Perhaps this was the point. Maybe the first good stock was there to entice them to keep trying. Who knows? Wish me luck, she said to the Aborigines that had remained there. Althea then walked to the summoning circle without another word. Good luck, my lord, the Aborigines uttered, also looking forward to it. They wondered if they would finally get another companion to share the good things with. To be honest, it was quite fun to watch fellow Aborigines' surprised faces when they encountered things from this territory. It made them quite proud. It also showed that, subconsciously or not, they already felt great sense of belonging to the territory. Althea did not know about the going-ons in their heads, however. She simply stood on the circle, paid a silver as required, hoping to actually get a decent one this time. Unfortunately, the first one was just a level E armor maker. While she considered it seriously to give Clutch an assistant, she paid another silver for the next slot anyway. The second slot was a gardener without any occupation at all. According to his description, he was very experienced in maintaining plants of the Lord's castle. Sighed. With pursed lips, she clicked on her final chance for the day, hoping not to waste another silver. His name, Lenny Poe. Level D. Abilities, production of low to mid-level clothing. Wage, 15 gold per month, food twice a day inclusive. Confirm, 3-3. Clothing. She seemed to have forgotten all about this. It was fortunate that Terrans had been given space early on and some time to prepare. Pretty much everyone who survived had several changes of clothing. However, after the initial suffering, a lot of clothes should have been destroyed. In time, they would really have no clothes left. She herself and her children had ample of clothing, enough change of clothing that could rotate a week, so she really didn't feel the problem before. Immediately, she hired the NPC, and a bright light illuminated the room, revealing a middle-aged woman with a simple but comfortable dress. However, it was notable that her eye bags were big, her eyes were dull, and her whole person had a somber feel to it. The woman was a bit surprised when she saw Althea, but quickly caught herself and saluted. "My lord." "Call me Althea, Elder, or Miss Althea. My identity is a secret here." "Yes, Elder Althea." "Well, good enough," Althea mused before she continued speaking. "May I know how your profession differs from non-professionals?" "The clothing I create has defensive properties. Similar to armor makers, though armor makers could produce other accessories like gloves, knee guards, and shields." Althea nodded and quickly assigned her a job. "Okay, I will assign you a place. How many pieces of clothing can you make?" The woman stared for a moment, blinking. "What cloths do we have available in the territory, my lord?" "Later." Darn, she was happy too soon. "So, how do you guys get your clothing?" Althea asked after a pause, looking around and facing the other NPCs as well. The NPCs looked at each other. They also forgot about this problem. Although on their part, while they were impressed with the fabric the Lord and the others had, they saw that the clothes did not provide any defense attribute at all. Hence, they didn't ask for fear of offending people. Nobles tend to call on seamstresses and clothes makers to their houses to create bespoke attires. Most territories have clothing stores where commoners could buy their attires. For villages, there's usually just one, while town level and above would have at least one store carrying products from one or two of the cloth cities. Cloth cities. Oslo nodded. Well, the art of cloth making is dominated by 3 cities: Cloth City, Kilpo City, and Makita City. All fabric known to humans have all basically come from there. "Oh, tell me more, and what are the differences in their products?" Cloth City is known for its extremely smooth fabrics with natural sheen. This is the favorite of nobles. Kilpo City specializes in highly insulating cloth suitable for cold climates. However, they also supply simpler clothing commoners used. Makita City fabrics were better known for its fabrics with soft pile that could create rich texture. Nobles also like this, but they're a bit uncomfortable and only worn during formal occasions. They also provide what we call Makita cloth, which was a type of cloth that was more accessible to commoners, albeit much more expensive than Kilpo's. Althea listened carefully. If she were to take on similarities based on the description, it seemed Cloth City specialized in something like silk, Kilpo with something like wool, while Makita was something like velvet, perhaps. Similarly, cheaper cloth was also available from Kilpo and Makita. "Mine is from Kilpo," Clutch said, lifting his sleeves up. "It is a bit rougher compared to what I see your people use, my lord." She looked closer, and it looked a bit like hemp cloth. "My clothes are from Makita," Brenda said. And the others, sans Oslo and Betty, said theirs were the same. Looking closer, it was very similar to linen that she also wanted to produce. "Any idea what their raw materials are?" Oslo and the others all shook their heads. "We apologize, my lord. It is a closely guarded secret by these cities." "Indeed," Lenny said. "To my knowledge, the recipes have been exclusive to them for centuries." Oslo's dark blue eyes suddenly turned sharp. He abruptly stood up and stared at the Althea. "My lord, are you planning on producing yourself? I'm afraid." He was afraid that the territory would be targeted. Don't think the level difference was so large that they wouldn't touch Althea. There was a limit of 10 attacks per year if you were an attacker, but there was not as stringent a limit in receiving one. A territory could actually be attacked every 16 days. That was to say, the village could get attacked twice a month if the territory was particularly attractive. If a territory was targeted by an allied force, then they may have to experience wheel battles once or twice a month. As very rich cities, these 3 cities had a lot of subsidiary territories allied to them. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," Althea said, taking note of his caveat. "Besides, they may not pay attention to us. Didn't you notice our clothing doesn't have any attributes at all?" The NPCs nodded, and Althea continued. "Even with Lenny, the attributed clothing may have to do with raw materials." With this, the NPC's shoulders slumped in relief. Her lips twitched. However, she thought, if it did come to the point she'd be targeted for producing products that would break the monopolies of powerful entities. Althea did not panic. She knew she just needed to make sure she was invincible at least to a territory a level above her. She wasn't planning on tucking away their resources for fear of others. After all, Althea was meant to be proud. Putting these things for far in the future aside, for now, her emerald eyes landed again on the clothing of the NPCs. From here, she could tell Oslo and Betty were well off, using silk-like fabrics in their clothing. She was especially concerned with the commoner clothes, though, which they needed the most. It was just that she didn't know if there were flax plants or similar plants here. In Terran, those were found predominantly in areas with sandy loam and temperate climates. The weather system alone in this place was very different. Who knew where those plants were? However, she did seem to see plants similar to hemp nearby, so she could at least have some place to start. And although hemp was made for coarser fabric, it was a very good alternative. It was also more environmentally friendly, sustainable, and could be planted very densely, allowing for huge output per field. Still, she would still be looking for flax or its alternatives, simply because of its practicality and comfort. Cotton, on the other hand, was also difficult. Cotton seeds weren't sold in supermarkets, so she didn't have any on hand. But while she did not have cotton seeds on hand, the hotel duvets might have some. She immediately made plans to ask Eugene to put the bicycle project on hold in favor of weaving tools, whichever raw material they would end up using. In fact, the old tools for hemp or flax were relatively simple and didn't need a lot of mechanisms. It was cotton that was a bit difficult. Cotton was also a good type of cloth, especially for uses aiming for comfort like underwear and everyday shirts. It also had better moisture resistance than the others. This would be needed if their only other alternative was cloth made from hemp. So if she really found cotton seeds, Eugene could only succumb and find a way for a cotton weaving machine. Hence, Althea not only built a few more farms dedicated to the crops, but she also reserved another factory to make cloth. This factory would be focusing on making rolls, and rolls alone. She wasn't planning on making her own clothing store. It was enough to provide raw materials. She believed in the skills and creativity of their Terrans. Let them handle the fashion industry by themselves. In this way, she could focus on the creation of different types of fabric, different qualities, and a wider variety of colors. She turned to Lenny. "While waiting, can you write down all you know about cloth, the popular styles and the like?" Lenny nodded, then she looked around. "May I borrow some parchment?" Later. She forgot the paper was still under development. She looked at the NPCs. "Where do you get parchments?" "I think a new store should be made available upon upgrade. It's a shop called Bookstore." Althea leaned in a bit, interested. "Oh, what else is available?" "There are different types of parchment, like the cheaper papyrus to the more expensive animal skins. Ink and pens are also sold here." "And that's all?" She looked at the NPCs with a weird expression. "There are weaponry stores, armory stores, and now even a bookstore, but there's no clothing store." Later. They didn't know either. Althea couldn't help remembering the 3 cloth cities. Could big territories dictate available building types? Anyway, unless there was something magic about the parchments, she would definitely not waste a building slot on it. Paper only needed investment and a bit of technical knowledge. She and Eugene had partnered with Baron's team for this, and they had been working on it for a while now. Hopefully, they will get the finished products within a few days. It was the ink and graphite that would be the challenge. She'd need to check the warehouse if some materials were sold to the territory. As all these things passed by her head, she couldn't help but pause with a frown. She still had so much lined up in her lab, so much land to explore. But how could she start anything in her precious field with all these issues popping out? There was so much to do. If there was only someone to handle these things with her. Nispedana mountain range, 22 kilometers away. Ansel behind you, Leo yelled, stabbing a monster that almost mauled him. Fortunately, Ansel's body coordination was very good, and he managed to avoid the claw behind him. However, it did nick a good part of his shirt and pants. While the bleeding wasn't bad, it definitely destroyed his shirt. Damn, that was his last decent clothing. Well, at least he had it. Everyone else had holes everywhere, and were almost looking like jungle people. He shook his head of the thoughts and focused on the mob at hand. Used stab D, -2 mana. Killed Nomos LV1, +30 copper, +30 experience. Used stab D, -2 mana. Used stab D, -2 mana. Killed Tanto Rat LV1, +30 copper, +30 experience. They fought and stabbed until the last monster fell. During this time, their teamwork had improved leaps and bounds, and a small mob like this was no longer life-threatening. After the battle, they dragged their legs in the direction without resting. One was to avoid monsters attracted by the blood, and the second was that Ansel couldn't bear to rest. The group soon got used to Ansel's packing and managed to continue on. The redhead looked back at the huge man next to him. This is the direction, right? Bull nodded. Their team definitely went in this direction. As he confirmed this for the nth time, Ansel found himself more and more energized, his feet hastening its movements even more. He was so unstoppable that he ignored another piece of cloth falling off him, showing off his good abs and chest, and making the girls blush. Ansel did not even bother with this. He was in too much of a good mood. He had an intuition. He would see Althea very soon. 13 days of protection period. Days breezed by in the territory, and a lot of changes were witnessed during this time. There were more and more people joining the territory, adding life to an already lively place. They were haggard and devoid of hope when they entered, but without exemption, they would quickly regain vitality, and it was a sight that brought joy to those who watched it. More and more people also grew stronger, even if they weren't fighters, joining the guards in their hunting outside the walls, protecting the territory in their own way. With every step towards strength they took, the belief in protecting their home was ingrained deeper and deeper into their hearts. More and more buildings were erected, promising stability. More and more shops were established, enhancing vitality. Streets became more and more lively as time went on, reassuring people's hearts despite the uncertain future. Each of these changes added a layer of happiness, pride, and satisfaction to each of its citizens. Slowly but surely, even with the advent of the protection period looming over them, everyone felt stable, taking one step at a time with a smile. That morning, Althea was prepared to take a walk around the territory with her children to give them their much-needed vitamins and exposure to the outside world. According to her research, healthy exposure to sunlight would also allow the children to have a healthy circadian rhythm and would have better sleep patterns. Exposing them outside also exposed their senses to various stimuli, sounds and sights, which would be good for their cognitive development. She brought them out wearing enough shade, hats and covers weaved by people in the market, and finally entered the world outside. Like yesterday, it was only the three of them, which was just right and relaxed. As for where the rest of the team was, the adults were busy with a lot of assignments, and polishing the systems of the industries assigned to them. Even the children had their own busy schedules. Maya insisted on being independent and gathering resources. As one of the few children in the territory, Horace similarly refused to be a dead weight as well, helping out his new big sister. On the other hand, Fufi was officially the mascot of the guard team, while Theodore had found a liking just watching Eugene tinker with his tools like a good baby boy. Pet stats. Name Fufi. Age 2. Level 4 15,682, 0000. Life 1310-2000. Spirit 1322-000. Physical 171. Agility 176. Defense 144. Mana 500. Skills: active none, passive none, elemental affinity earth, titles none, overall rank. Althea smiled, knowing Fufi was not being lax with his training. She pushed the pretty stroller forward and was met with a couple of admiring words from people around. After they left the more crowded spaces, the family stayed in one of the parks for a while, with the children cooing excitedly. Althea stretched her arms and let the Barbies have their breath of nature for a while, before taking them to Auntie Mathilda's older lady friends for babysitting. MNG Mama, little Pepper mumbled, seeing that she was heading off, and little Meatball was not to lose. Duguar Glegleg. Lola and Yana laughed, shaking the Barbies' bespoke rattles in front of them. Althea also smiled and gave her Barbies another set of wet smooches. She looked at the old women, who looked at the Barbies lovingly. "Thank you for this," she said, and the two women shook their heads. "Thank you for trusting us," Lola said, and Yana couldn't help but add, "Trust us when we tell you this is our favorite part of the day." Althea smiled and thanked them again, giving a few seeds from her space as a reward, as she knew about their hobbies. After settling the children, she went to take a look at the status of construction in the territory. After huge amounts of investment, it was finally the last leg of this construction phase, for this level anyway. The 10 new factories were done, and now the construction team was focusing on building the perpendicular commercial street, thereby named Market Street. Market Street was a kilometer-long street about 6 meters wide, designed only for pedestrian access. It was lined with small trees and benches in the middle, dividing it into 2 wide lanes. The shops here were set to sell, and or rent for about 30% more expensive than the commercial street along the main avenues, because of the inevitably higher foot traffic. This was especially true for the shops on the intersection, set to be twice as expensive as the original stores. Obviously, these shops would be empty for a while, but it wouldn't take long. She had long heard of the demand for stores. These would definitely be swept off within the day, though the renovation should last a little longer. She also bought off one corner shop. She was not sure what she'd use it for, but it was too good a location not to use herself. At the 2 ends of this street were small parks, complete with various trees and flowers, as well as a playground set made by the woodworkers. Adjacent to the parks would be large buildings 10 times the size of the usual unit in floor area. 3 were set per end, and she reserved 2 on one side for her supermarket. These were all quite large developments and were not for sale. They could only be leased every year. There was also a territory owned in on each end, aiming to target the middle-class market. As for the super luxurious hotels, that was a thing for later. Having the current development was luxury enough. Other things could wait for when rich aborigines like Oslo arrived, whenever that might be. She arrived at the end and watched the construction ongoing. She had already built the streets with modular units, and now only a few buildings that were being manually constructed were left. Her supermarket was already in the finishing phase, while the adjacent ones were already topping off. Overall, this was technically overdevelopment, but she didn't want the area to look empty when it already had a designation. More importantly, she believed in her territory. It wouldn't take long for the development to catch up. It was both intuition and her pride. As for how so much construction was done in such a short time, a lot of it had to do with manpower. If Baron and her team hired about a combined 1/5 of the total population, then the construction team hired by the territory took another. Over half of the abled men and women in the territory worked in the construction team. Basically, except for the guards who was always hunting outside for at least half a day, everyone had a day job and were otherwise training in their free time, which was required for hired hands anyway. This was fortunate because she really didn't think too deeply about this aspect. There was no way, other than the required hunting time and the overall levels, she really didn't think much about the strength of the people and left it all to Drake and Rowan. As long as the walls were ready to defend whatever happened, she put this issue to the back of her mind. It wasn't her specialty, and to be frank, she didn't have much interest in it. She was extremely lucky to have sincere people in the field working for her. Of course, her ideal was still her husband taking the helm. In that case, then she'd really have nothing to worry about. Anyway, a lot of these people chose construction because it also trained their physiques. It was also because of this that the territory changed so much in just a few days. Of course, this was not without the help of magic, and a lot of funds from her own pocket. Brother Oslo, that's so cool. Speak of the devil, she turned her head to see Oslo using his earth magic to lift the stones on the ground, serving as a crane to take materials up. Oslo was a rare dual elementalist. Back then, when she saw the NPCs so shocked, she was a bit startled because she didn't know it was that rare. You are a dual elementalist, the usually cool Rowan exclaimed. He happened to be there because he was making rounds. Is it so rare? Althea asked, walking next to him. Rowan stopped himself. Yes, Ms. Althea, not even 1 out of 100 elementalists have dual elements. Althea looked awkwardly at her 3 elements in her stats. She decided not to tell what her stats were until she knew more about it. In any case, the elementalists had definitely assisted in the fast development of the territory, and they proved themselves to be quite the value for money. She hoped there would be more elementalists popping up in her options, but she somehow doubted it. If they were really as rare as Rowan said, they were unlikely to show up in her little village. It could be said she struck gold to have encountered Oslo and Rowan, and so early too. She watched the construction of the supermarket in a daze because of this, only to be pulled to the present some time later by a familiar voice. She turned her head to meet the chubby face with the name of Baron. You got the building before me again, he said. You came in a close second, she said with a smile. You are really updated. Indeed, she was really surprised by this guy's news channel. She was the Lord, so, obviously, she got first pick. But this guy was already waiting in the village center, just as she posted the opening. Baron was a bit smug. A businessman's intuition, was all he said. Well, fortunately, my building will be finished tomorrow. The lease for that is no joke. Althea smiled. He was referring to the building on the other end of Market Street, directly opposite to her supermarket. He took the entire corner. I'm sure it'd be a good investment. Yep, that's for sure, Tilda. The two chatted for a while, mostly business-related, before Althea excused herself, aiming to take a look at the other projects. She walked to the other side, where the streets were still under construction. The utility systems had been embedded underground, and soon small lakes and wells, dug so quickly thanks to Oslo, would be easily accessible to every block. The utilities were almost completely developed along the roads, under the green islands. She had built some aqueducts as well, for areas near the mountains to gather water from the springs easily. The NPCs had never stopped marveling about the concept of bringing water straight to the houses. Although technically it hadn't been done yet, it was such common sense to all the Terrans that they couldn't help but believe its doability as well. Of course, they added some controlling mechanisms that maintained the previous pricing for utilities. They didn't increase the rates, though, which was something celebrated by the people. Similarly, waste management was also settled. Except for system food-based buildings, other buildings didn't have self-cleaning functions. Because she didn't purchase any food buildings, this meant every building had to have its own waste management. Fortunately, the materials here were mostly natural, so the waste management wasn't a particularly big headache to deal with. This was also a new thing to the NPCs. The world here, apparently, was very much like the medieval period in their world, where there was no such thing as waste management. In slums, people even directly defecated on the streets. She cringed. For the next phase, she was pondering whether to build police stations, fire stations, and other necessary public buildings. As the population grew, these would be essential, at least in their minds as they grew up with these benefits. As the wise men said, it was easy to shift from poverty to luxury, but not the other way around. The school and library would be deferred not only because of the paper issue, but also because there were less than a dozen miners in the territory, most of whom were over 10 and were already helping out their families. She also built a few more fields and factories. One was a permanent kiln, which would be necessary with the increasing population and needs. They had already figured out a way to handle the temperature needed by ceramic and porcelain. When these were done more efficiently, she expected most houses to regain their porcelain water closets and tubs. Of course, she didn't forget about the cloth factory. Although linen was a long shot, they really found cotton seeds. Interestingly, it wasn't in the hotel duvet that they found it. After all, 5-star hotel duvets had undergone a lot of quality checks. Instead, they found the seeds inside the cotton down jackets from the supermarket back in Terran, which happened to be stored in Fufy's space. Hey, a little hero indeed. Unfortunately, they weren't much, so she had to do a lot of treatment to speed up its growth and development. Fortunately, she had Gru, who was familiar with the growing conditions of the plant, helping her out this time. It had been a few days, but sprouts had already formed, and they would eventually be looking forward at the shrubs. The other factory of hers would be dealing with the long-awaited wall tree products like rosin and, hopefully, rubber. Of course, she'd need to transplant several of said trees back into the territory. Oh, and she also needed to bring home those Haozen berry shrubs and Julie trees and plants, which were essential for her sprite solution. She smiled at the list of assignments. Why? Because she finally had the excuse to go out again. When Drake and the others saw Althea outside the southwest gate alone, in full gear, no less, they were taken back. What was this beautiful woman who had just given birth doing outside the walls? Fufy, on the other hand, was just happy and running around her in excitement. Adventure, adventure. Althea chuckled and patted the good boy's head as she sensed his thoughts. Wanna come with me? Fufy's smiling head bobbed, telling her of his approval. It just made her laugh. Not far, the team of guards couldn't help but watch the beautiful scenery that she made for a while. Drake was the first to approach the woman, blushing a bit. He still hadn't overcome his fear of beautiful women, but thanks to the patient perseverance of his many suitors, he was getting better. Ms. Althea, where are you going? Exploring for some plants, she said with a smile. Drake turned to the deep forest beyond and frowned. You can just tell us and we. No, I need to do it myself. You probably don't know this, but I have appraisal skills. If it were others, they may just die of poison. But this is an order from a village elder. Drake stared at her in conflict before sighing. Well, then at least let a few of us escort you, he said, looking back at his team who naturally had no complaints. Drake nodded in approval before turning to Althea with a smile. After all, what kind of guard team are we if we can't even protect an elder? In the end, 15 people were tasked to accompany her, while the rest kept the guard duty in their area. This included Drake, Fufy, and the Hugo uncle and nephew duo. I'm surprised you actually entered the guards team, she said, and the duo gave a shy smile. We had wanted to form our own force at first and be our own boss, but... The handsome Hugo chuckled and finished the sentences for his nephew. The territory charmed us. Indeed, the territory was so good, how could they not love it? And also, how could they say they were also heavily inspired by the beautiful image of a lone pregnant woman defending a gate by herself? After all, such a good territory was guarded so tightly by so many people who had only stayed there for a few days, and this was including a pregnant woman. Inexplicably, they wanted to join them too. With a good atmosphere, the small group headed in a specific direction. The guards looked curiously at the compass in her hand. One of the guards was a little older and looked nostalgic. It's been a while since I've seen an old compass, he said, using that old man's tone of his. My father used to take me to the mountains near our village. Then you must be rich to have a forest near your home, another one said. Half of their Terran planet was dead due to the overuse of the previous generations. Unlike before in their generation, living near the forest actually meant a luxury trip. The man rolled his eyes. I'm telling a story here, all right. The friend laughed. All right, continue. Similar conversations echoed around the group. Obviously, even when they were guards and trained, Drake and Rowan adopted a relatively light-hearted handling where the soldiers could freely chat as they wanted. Of course, this was in the condition that they remained vigilant at all times. They could chat, but their attention and senses must always be directed outwards. This half-listening attitude also caused some tangents in the conversations, which was also amusing to listen to. For example, a guard would ask his friend what he ate for breakfast, and in response, the friend would answer he woke up early to exercise. There was also a case where someone was singing, but someone sincerely thought there was a monster croaking. It was quite funny. Anyway, as they walked, Althea occasionally taught them which plants would be useful to them, as well as their emergency handling, while gathering some for her own use. For example, she taught them which herb could hasten blood clotting. For example, which plants would be filling when eaten even with the most basic preparation methods. And for example, she also taught them which plants were poisonous. In the same vein, she taught them which partner plant was needed as an antidote. Of course, all this knowledge was all basic and couldn't be compared to the professionals handling them, but the knowledge could definitely save lives. The guards knew this and they listened thoroughly, admiring this beautiful woman even more in their hearts. They watched as she found a particularly interesting plant and asked them to rest. Hugo looked at her smiling face filled with passion. It was obviously a topic she liked very much. An admirable genius, he said, could not help adding to himself, her husband is a lucky man. He is, Drake answered beside him, surprising both Hugo and Helios. Do you know him? We were soldiers together, Drake said but didn't elaborate. Hugo wanted to ask more until they heard a small flop nearby them. To their surprise, it was made by the woman as she took out a machine from her space. This is my portable lab, Tori, she said with a happy face, taking some specimens and tinkering with it. There was also a notebook and pen on hand ready to record the changes. She was very eager and like a little girl, very much unlike the goddess of war in his first impression. Hugo in particular found it extremely cute. Drake also smiled, though for a very different reason. Years ago, more than once, he remembered Garen's monologue about occasionally feeling jealous of a Tory. They're indifferent, Captain. When a little drunk, droned on about how his wife sometimes only had Tory in her eyes, how Tory took all her time. He had always thought it was a pet or something. Only now did he know what it was. He shook his head in amusement at the memory, before regaining his serious face, and ordered the soldiers to set up a temporary camp for lunch. Hence, while Althea did her experiments, the soldiers set up a campfire for a barbecue, using the special barbecue sauce from her gear grocery store, of course. As they prepared the meal, their stomachs started growling. Sadly, until after they ate, the beautiful elder was still immersed with her notes. Should we tell her? One soldier asked. Wouldn't that be very rude? Another soldier added worriedly. Drake, on the other hand, had heard about Althea's bouts. If they didn't disturb her now, they might as well prepare for dinner. However, before he could say anything, Althea had already straightened her back and ran to them, raising an elongated tube-like leaf in front of his face. We have it now, she exclaimed, bright like a child. Salt. Hearing her words, Drake's eyes sparkled a bit, but his expression did not betray. Everyone's rapt attention was on them, while Rowan was just a bit puzzled, but also quite curious about what they were talking about. But as Drake looked closer, he saw that it was just a plant, the flute plant, which was the local equivalent of wheat. He looked at Althea in puzzlement, and she put it closer to his eyes. Not the plant, look closer, the powder. I traced a huge amount of salt here, she said, taking it away before Drake could actually see the alleged powder. There must be a source nearby. Without listening to other people's opinions, she began to go in a direction as soon as she cleared up. Along the way she pulled out random plants for testing, checking if they any had traces of salt. It took a while, but they patiently followed the traces and really seemed to be finding something, at least according to the elders' increasingly excited expressions. Soon the green forest opened up to a clearing with a cave filled with multicolored satin stones, and they couldn't believe their eyes. It was a glistening wonder of different shades sculpted through centuries, making their eyes shine, and then there was the faint scent of minerals whiffing through their noses, exciting their bodies. It was definitely a salt mine, and it was huge. Oh gosh! The soldiers brightened, and Althea clapped her hands. Althea immediately went there to test the items with her gloves. When she confirmed that it was indeed salt, everyone cheered like they just won the lottery. So far they've been using fruit and other plants to deal with their needs for salt, but it was really not enough. Their river was a freshwater source, so they couldn't get salt there at all. Now it was here, in such an unexpected place. Althea quickly taught them how to gather the items. Although most of them didn't carry chisels and hammers, their weapons were good enough alternatives, especially since they wouldn't be able to harvest everything anyway. Everyone took as much as their spaces and backpacks could carry, with Althea warning them that the rock salts had to be purified first before consumption. Althea looked wistfully at the amount of rock salts in front of her that she couldn't take. If only they had more space. Regretfully, she could only mark this place. In any case, they finished eating lunch on site and continued on their way to the actual target of the excursion. After walking a couple of hours, they eventually reached an area of predominantly tall trees, mostly coniferous. She took out her tools to harvest some fruit and sap again, placing some in her space and some to her backpack. "Let me carry it for you, Ms. Althea," Hugo offered, and she accepted his kindness with a smile. She then placed a tag on the location of the wall tree area to post uprooting missions through the village center. Tagging was another function of the map, and the transfer of data was taught to them by the NPCs. With tagging, people could mark places on their maps. They could send these coordinates for whatever function they needed, and whoever received this tag would have an additional area on their maps, even if they hadn't been there yet. Of course, like everything, this came at the cost of a couple of silvers per transfer. "It's done," she said with a smile. "Let's go. I'll treat you to our Gia restaurant when we get home," she added, and the guards cheered, sycophantically adding, "The elder is good, the elder is great," making her laugh out loud. On their way home, they used a slightly different pathway to maximize their trip. Because of this, Althea had managed to harvest a few more plants, and the guards learned more before the trip was over. However, during one of their stops, Fufi suddenly stopped and growled, facing a direction. Althea frowned and her ears moved, sharpening her hearing. They stood up to follow the distant noise, and soon the sounds became clearer and clearer, and their frowns getting deeper and deeper in response. A few hundred meters away, some sort of scuffle was ongoing, an ominous combination of growls and screams echoing to their ears. They looked at each other, and they quickly ran in the direction. "Nope. Pay attention," Ansel yelled, killing the small mob of monsters, saving Luke from death. Since Leo was gravely injured, Luke had gone berserk. "Get yourself together," he yelled before attacking another level 2 monster. He looked back to see a few people getting mauled, but he couldn't care for them now, as he was too busy protecting himself. In addition to their small group before, they now totaled to 100 people. They encountered another group of people, over 100 of them, that had settled in a complicated cave system they encountered by chance. They've been here for a few days, escaping from another village that was just taken down by a beast tide. It was fine at first, even a little happy to find more brethren, but they realized the beast tide wasn't actually over yet, and it was still clearing in their direction. Even if Ansel was already at the peak of level 3, facing a sea of monsters had taken a toll. To be blunt and exact, he was on the verge of dying. "Gyahhh," someone beside him yelled as his arm was bitten off. Right next to him was a woman, and she was dragged by a smaller monster deeper into the mob. "Help me," she yelled, and those were the last words she would utter as she drowned in the sea of beasts, each body part ripped apart for consumption of different monsters. This was happening all around him. He watched as the hundreds of people lost a portion with a heavy heart, but he gritted his teeth and fought on. He also watched his life and spirit starting to drain, and yet there was no end in sight in the sea of beasts. Worse, somewhere along the way, he tripped over a corpse and slightly lost balance. He managed to stop himself from falling head-on, but the moment he lifted his head, he saw a massive mouth with sharp teeth aiming to glomp at his face. His heart dropped to the ground as he saw his impending death in front of him. Ansel was not reconciled. He hadn't even seen Althea and Garen yet. Worse, his eyes saw an accurate arrow enter the monster's mouth and exited through its skull. He wasn't even able to absorb what happened when 10 more monsters around him were taken down in a similar manner, creating a vacuum of safety around him. He stiffly turned his head in the direction of the shooter, and his eyes met her beautiful emerald ones. Ansel immediately burst into tears. Aberdeen City, 16 years prior. Ansel felt his head spinning as he was carried away like a dirty potato sack by the teenage boy who rescued them. On the other hand, the little girl was comfortably carried on his arm, her arms intimately wrapped around the older boy's neck. She was safe, protected, and very comfortable with one of the teen's hands making sure she didn't get hit by stray twigs. Ansel, in contrast, was very different. There was even an occasional branch that hit his face. The distinction was very stark. "Garen," he could hear the girl sob. "Are you okay?" she asked, a milky voice filled with worry. Ansel couldn't see the teen's reaction, though, as his line of sight was on the ground the whole time. As they ran, the boy responded with a simple, and then they entered the denser forest and his pace quickened so they could get away from the kidnappers as soon as possible. Ansel was already feeling nauseous from the previous pace, but now he got even dizzier as the boy ran quickly across the woods. Glop, glop, glop. The surroundings were shaking so much, it was like his brain was jiggling. Glop, glop, glop. Eventually, he couldn't handle it anymore, and he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he saw the worried faces of his parents. Immediately, all the wrongs of the world popped like a balloon. "Mom, Dad," he squeaked, a pool of tears quickly lining up his eyes. All the tension and suffering seemed to overflow with his tears, and he started sobbing. Mother looked heartbroken and immediately approached him, placing him in her warm embrace. He was not good with words and he didn't like using them, so he expressed his sadness with sobs. It took him a while to calm down, and he finally looked around, little eyebrows furrowing when he wasn't able to see what he was expecting to see. Mother held back a smile. "Are you looking for your new friends?" He nodded cutely. Mother suppressed a smile and turned to father. His father gave a knowing smile in return and went out the door. Several minutes later, he re-entered with 2 beautiful children on each side. There was the girl from before, even cuter, all cleaned up and with her hair tied in twin pigtails. Just looking at her comforted him very much. The teen was even scarier and cooler, although he was covered with a lot of bandages all over his body. He couldn't tell at all he was injured by how he carried both of them. Inexplicably, he looked cooler in Ansel's eyes. Anyway, the little redhead's eyes were wide as he stared at them, feeling extremely elated to see them. He felt his mother pat his small head. "This is your new sister and brother," she said, smiling, and Ansel's green eyes went wide in shock. Mother laughed and gently pinched his cheek, getting him off the bed and pulling him closer to the 2 older kids. "Don't you want to greet them?" "Present. Althea," he yelled, but unfortunately, there were too many monsters between them. It was those ugly blue frogs as tall as his waist that were in the dozens, the metaphorical gorges between him and Althea. With renewed energy, he went ahead and swung his sword, using his skills as much as he could. Killed Juju Frog, LVL2, plus 50 experience, plus 50 copper. Killed Juju Frog, LVL1, plus 30 experience, plus 30 copper. Killed Juju Frog, LVL1, plus 30 experience, plus 30 copper. Killed Juju Frog, LVL2, plus 50 experience, plus 50 copper. Killed Juju Frog, LVL1, plus 30 experience, plus 30 copper. As he killed, he could see himself getting closer and closer to her, and he had all but ignored his spirit. He started another bout of killing spree, gathering enough experience and finally upgrading. Congratulations on reaching level 4. Learned Piercing Strike E, consumes -5 mana. Stats. Name, Ansel Witt. Age 23. Level 4 231,0000. Life 265,600. Spirit 185,600. Physical 89. Agility 75. Defense 54 plus 1. Mana 400. Physical potential S. Mental potential A+. Skills. Active Stab E, Piercing Strike E. Passive None. Elemental Affinity Fire. Titles None. Overall rank A. Current status Normal. This upgrade increased his efficiency effectively, and he slowly killed his way to get closer to Althea, the team he was with closely following the path he made, similarly killing their way through. Soon they were only a couple of meters away, and he noticed that the people Althea brought with her were extremely strong. Each one seemed to be at least his level before upgrading. Those who were focused on close-ranged fights were fast and valiant, while those with arrows were quite accurate in the hits. They were also protected by swords and spearmen, and they could hit away without worry. There were several hundreds of monsters they had to work with, but this team didn't look like they would ever be in danger. It was amazing, and his heart couldn't help but lift up in awe and relief. He was particularly impressed with those 2 tanned men with similar looks. One had a spear and the other had a sword. Their teamwork was impeccable. They didn't even have to turn around to see how the other dealt with the enemy. yet they could somehow add to the attack effectively. For instance, one would slash a few level 1 gnomos along his feet, and the other would stab the ones behind with his spear. Like this, they created a vacuum of safety around them. They were very handsome and cool, moving with smooth movements, though their techniques seemed different from those of the veterans he had seen. Speaking of veterans, he couldn't help but look at the dashing short-haired man similarly waving his sword. Unlike most, though, he had a wooden shield with him, which he used to push enemies just before beheading them. Some old buried memory as a young teen being thrown in obstacle course after obstacle course came to mind, and unconsciously his eye twitched. Drake. Chapter 184, Sibling Reunion, Part 2. Drake, Ansel yelled, seeing a familiar figure also valiantly dealing with the mob. When Garen smuggled him into the Special Forces training grounds, Drake was one of the people he was thrown to. The guy's training was very harsh, and his entire body would be dead tired by nighttime. Later, Ansel found it was because he looked too feminine, and Drake happened to have a great emphasis. Great weakness against beautiful women. Ansel was offended at first, but then he learned to take advantage of that by acting like a sissy, and Drake couldn't wait to escape from him, successfully lightening up his load. He was a genius even at that age. It had already been a few years, though. He heard that Drake had already retired. The man raised an eyebrow, looking him up and down as he slashed, giving him a nod in the end. This was all done as he got rid of several monsters using his weapon. Was that a nod of approval? Did he finally look masculine? Ansel also noticed a couple of people around Althea, protecting her, some of which were in charge of long-range attacks. There were not only close-range fighters, but there were also archers with a special bow. Are those crossbows? He asked no one in particular. Was this available in any weapons store he had been to? Didn't seem like it. He also couldn't help but notice their states. Everyone looked so stable. It was in stark contrast with the haggardness and panic on their side, which was the normal bearing through all the territories they'd been to so far. Why did it feel so different from what he'd encountered? Then a wall of fire appeared in front, killing a handful of monsters in one go. What the heck? Magic. Whoa, awesome. Despite being grossly outnumbered, the fights became increasingly easy from this point. Anyway, seeing the newcomers deal with the monsters so well, someone could even make a fire whip, injected stimulants to their side. Their group of nearly 100 people fought hard for their lives, hope revitalizing their lackluster energies, and there were no more deaths after that. Eventually, the mob thinned, and the miserable group noticed there were no more monsters attacking. We did it! Yes! They cheered while some groveled on the ground, some due to extreme joy, and some due to sadness for those they lost. If only you got here sooner, my daughter, she sobbed, hitting the nearby guard. However, the guard did not do anything and let her vent. Of course, most people were just thankful and gave the guards a hug. On the other side, Ansel was finally within a few meters of Althea. The woman smiled and opened her arms, welcoming him. His feet moved on their own, and he went to her without another thought. When he entered her embrace and felt her warmth, his tear ducts that had been pouring since he saw her seemed to have a renewed water source, and snot also came out. Althea was not disgusted. Instead, she laughed and good-naturedly rubbed his back, still a kid, crying so miserably. The people who had been used to Ansel's cool and collected image were taken aback by the sight. Althea raised her head and finally noticed this group, and then she saw their miserable appearance. She patted Ansel's back. Let's deal with your friend's wounds first. Ansel finally remembered he was with a party and quickly swiped his snot with his back to them. When he turned around, he was all cool again. If they couldn't see his reddish eyes and nose, they'd have thought everything was a hallucination. Ansel watched as Althea dealt with the injured using copious amounts of potions and herbs. As his eyes followed her body, his heart was full. He knew he had somewhat ambiguous emotions towards Althea. It was no longer platonic, but at the same time not entirely sexual. The process of this realization had hit his worldview very deeply, to the point that he started dating around to see the difference. However, he never acted on it. He knew the dynamics of their relationships would be ruined if he did so. Althea being awkward with him would have been the greatest torture. Ansel always knew that there were plenty of things where one choice changed everything. just like when they were children. Had he not gotten out of hiding when Althea was in danger, they wouldn't even be acquaintances now. In any case, Ansel had felt an unprecedented sense of peace with Althea, now only a few meters away from him. He barely noticed his injuries until Althea went to treat them. "Here, drink this," she said, and he looked at the ceramic bottle. Did she take this from Terran, in interest, before drinking its contents? Just like this, his spirit improved fully. "This is amazing," he exclaimed, and Althea smiled, but she then went to treat his friends so he couldn't ask any more questions. Half an hour later, everyone was administered first aid, including Leo, who was rescued from certain future disability. It was amazing how quickly his blood clotted. There was no medicine building in their past territories, but it seemed that Althea's had, and the effect was very good. Even certain disability was dealt with ease. Disability? It was only now that he remembered. Wasn't she pregnant? What was she doing with a flat stomach? His heart dropped. Ansel immediately walked to Althea and held her shoulders, eyes staying worriedly at her stomach. Althea blinked, startled, but soon realized what this was about and gently patted his hand. "They're fine, they are at home." "Premature birth," he voiced out, heartbroken. How much had she suffered when he was away? Althea shook her head. "It's a long story. She just said, 'I'll tell you when we get home.'" And so, the group of over a dozen expanded to hundreds. What's more, the battles were easy, and a lot of people relaxed enough to chat. One of these was Ansel and the duo, primarily because Althea was busy discussing with the cool fire magic guy what to do with so many of them. "You could really fight. What style is that?" "It's a family legacy," Helios said with a grin, looking at the other man next to him. "I still have a lot to learn compared to my uncle." Ansel realized what he meant and gaped. "You're actually uncle and nephews. I thought you were brothers." "Well, the age gap between my dad and uncle was huge," he said. "Dad practically raised us both side by side." Ansel nodded, very interested, but his head brewing some other, unimportant, thoughts. The older one was about Garen's age, and the younger one was closer to him. He smirked. Hey, he thought maliciously, should he start calling Garen uncle? Chapter 185, Preparing the Base. Uncle Garen was irritated for some reason. He frowned, narrowing his eyes as he stared in a particular direction. "It feels like someone is scheming against me." Gil raised an eyebrow and looked around, puzzled, but they haven't done anything yet. Gil shrugged in the end and handed Garen a piece of parchment from his space. "It's here." Garen's azure eyes stayed on the piece of parchment before extending his hand. His rough fingers traced the symbols on the surface, and his sharp eyes studying every detail as if it was already built. It was a plan for their training ground, commissioned for a very, very high price from a Class D architect in the town. As of this morning, it was already halfway through construction. Gil was asking him to check before finalization, because any addition to the construction must be instructed now. Garen studied the drawing well in case they missed anything. He did make some minor improvements, but they didn't change the structure itself too much. The entire property was surrounded by stone walls, akin to level 2 walls from the territories. It was divided into a few sections with varying sizes. First, there was a central courtyard for main activities, obstacles courses, and drills. This area occupied nearly half of the entire lot. Next to these was an archery range, a wooded area for combat training, and some amenities. In fact, a lot of this would have costly amenities. For instance, they added verandas, gazebos, and gardens. There were a lot of new plants in this place. His wife said that beauty improved people's spirituality. Garen believed she was correct, so he invested in this as well. More importantly, he wanted his wife to live well here when he found her. If she had a stable environment, Althea would definitely swim like a fish in the ocean in this place, with new species to study. She would also love to have her own gardens to transplant these species, so she could study them more closely. That said, he needed to prepare a greenhouse for her as well, in case the weather turned dour and her plants could get destroyed. Seeing her sad would break his heart, so he ought to be proactive. After everything, ask if there's someone who can make greenhouses as well, he said, checking his budget, and nodded when he confirmed he should still have enough. Garen had used another source formula to make a deal with Jonathan, the Lord of Feral Town, to ensure the finances of the team. In exchange for 95% of the shares, They also got themselves a small lot of about an acre near the edge of the territory. They also got a lump sum amount of 300 gold, along with the remaining 2% share of the future proceeds for selling the formula. Garin looked at the plans again and nodded in satisfaction. With the help of Gil and Eagle, he didn't have to worry too much about this. The two assisted in the design of the land dedicated to military training to match their old headquarters and training hall, though with larger practice spaces because of their more destructive elements. Most of the land was assigned for training. There were tracks, obstacle courses, and sparring rings. The remaining buildings, except for the amenities he built for his wife, were huddled together on 3-story buildings, the maximum height that could be built with non-ether buildings. When will it be completed? I paid the construction company at a premium cost, and with Jonathan's help, the building is expedited. They estimated the remaining work would be completed within 2 days. The main residence is ready for occupancy now, by the way. Garin nodded and followed Gil to the newly built edifice. He looked at the residences, making sure they were made very well. Although he was usually a bit stingy, the facilities they added were complete. It would have large canteens with greening, nicely sized rooms for members in supervisory positions and above, as well as comfortable dormitories for others. These would also have decent bathrooms, at least the best that they could get considering the current technology. The entire residential area was overall the best they had seen since they traveled here, and this was actually made with their families in mind. After all, if the life inside the fog was horrible and the territories weren't good, their families may very well live here with them. This way, the moment they were found, they could immediately provide them with better living conditions. They also planned to hire decent men and women to enter the team, to expand their influence and power. Good living conditions were imperative to keeping talents. All this required a continuous flow of money, but Garin and the others were lucky to have landed in Ferrol. Ferrol town was known for its production of hula beef. The sauce Garin made after a lot of study was perfect for this type of meat, the perfect combination of various plants and fruits. When he got the life occupation of chef about a month prior, he had received a D-level identification skill along with it. It was thanks to this skill that he managed to make the 2 formulas without poisoning anyone. Anyway, through the partnership, not only Garin, but also Ferrol town made a lot of money, and it had only been a few days. It could be said that in such a short time, they earned a lord of a territory as backing. This was still considering their tense relationship with Gear Village, one of Ferrol town's many subsidiary villages. Now that they didn't have to spend money to buy information, the group finally had a surplus. Most of the team still saved money though, in an attempt to help out their probably dirt-poor families inside the fog. Garin himself maintained the simple lifestyle from before, saving up money to ensure his wife's lifestyle. Oh, also Ansel's, maybe. He frowned and went against it. Ansel was a grown man now, he ought to handle himself well enough by now. As such, all consideration for the little brother was scrapped, and he just double-checked the plans to make sure it was perfect not only for his team, but also for his wife. Hello.